This is Orobas II from Animal Factory Amplification. It's a dual VCA and saturator that uses vacuum tubes, and it's a bit of a beast. You can add character and saturation to sine waves by using it as a VCA and a synth voice. And if you crank the settings a bit, you can dial up some more extreme folding and distortion. You can build rich, distortion-fueled drones. And you can configure it to add a bit of lo-fi grit to several things at once. Animal Factory have built up a bit of a reputation as distortion specialists. They started out with guitar pedals before moving into Eurorack with modules like Baron Samedi, God Eater and Pit Viper. Now, in my own music I tend not to use particularly extreme distortion, and I have to admit that I've never even used anything that's based around vacuum tubes or valves. So when the guys at Animal Factory asked if they could send this unit over from India for me to check out, I wasn't totally sure how it would fit into my setup. But I soon discovered that while the Orobas is certainly capable of some pretty extreme sonic destruction, it's also capable of adding a more subtle character, and it has some very flexible routing options which make it a super powerful addition to a modular synthesis setup. It certainly packs a lot more in than a typical dual VCA. So in this video, I've built a few patches that put it through its paces and explore the sonic possibilities of vacuum tubes. Did I get bitten by the distortion bug? Guess you'd have to keep watching to find out, but first let's take a quick look at the controls. The first thing to say is that this is a big premium unit. It's 28 HP wide and comes in this luxurious box that contains the module, a pair of 6J32P tubes, mounting screws, power cable and a power supply for the tubes. Yep, the tubes run at higher voltages than the standard Eurorack 12 volts, so they need their own separate supply which connects to the front panel here. The module won't work at all without this, so you'll need to make sure you've got a spare power point nearby. You'll also get these protective guards for the tubes. Ordinarily it's a good idea to keep these on, but I'm going to leave them off for this video just because I think it looks a bit cooler if you can see the glass. Now the Orobas consists of two identical channels. Each side has two inputs which are mixed together and pass through a tube VCA which both amplifies and colours the sound. There are two CV inputs for the VCA, both with attenuverters. The first one is screen CV, which controls the screen grid in the tube. This is where you would typically patch an envelope to control the gain. There's also a screen CV offset knob, which lets you add up to 9 volts to the CV input. You can use a screen control switch to bypass this CV input altogether and fix it at maximum gain if you want to use Orobas as a saturating mixer, with the input gain pots serving as level controls. The other input is suppress CV, which controls the suppressor grid in the tube. Negative voltages here will reduce the gain, and you can get some quite interesting effects when you modulate this at audio rate. You can also bypass the suppress CV altogether with this switch. There's a plate bias switch next to each tube which adjusts the headroom, so you can effectively tame the amount of distortion a bit if you're finding the output too aggressive. And each channel has a volume pot that controls the output level post-tube next to the output jacks up here. Then there are a couple of important global controls. This switch controls whether the two channels run in parallel or series. In parallel mode you can use each side independently, but input 1 on the left side is also normal to input 1 on the right side, provided nothing is connected to it. So you could, for example, run the same sound through one side with cleaner settings and the other side with more extreme settings, and then mix the two together externally in whatever proportion you like. In series mode, the output of the left side is normal to input 1 on the right side, so you can run one signal through both tubes, one after the other. This lets you dial in some more extreme sound shaping. Finally, there's the evocation control and CV input, which is basically a feedback loop that sends the output of the right side back into input 1 on the left side. This pot lets you control it manually, or it acts as an attenuator for incoming CV. It can get pretty wild in series mode, but in parallel mode it can produce some really interesting wave shaping and folding effects, as you'll soon hear. So that's enough theory, let's get stuck into the patches. Okay, so let's start off by using Orobas as a kind of simple VCA for a sine wave oscillator. So I'm going to use the New Systems Instruments harmonic shift oscillator. I'm going to use the key step to play a simple sequence. I'm going to use mutable stages to produce a couple of envelopes. And then, yeah, Orobas is going to act as a VCA, and I can use some wave shaping and distortion to kind of mangle that sine wave a bit. First up, just for reference, here's the clean sine from the harmonic shift oscillator. And there's the sequence. So very nondescript, clean analog sine with no real harmonics. Let's run that through the Orobas. So I'm into the left side, I'm in parallel mode, I've got the input and output round about 12 o'clock. I've got the suppress CV turned off. I've got screen control on CV mode. I've got no offset, but I've got maximum CV the attenuator at maximum, so the envelope is controlling the amplitude. And at these settings, it's not colouring the sound too much. Just playing with the envelope decay shape there. But if I start to increase the gain on the input, it starts to square off the wave and add this nice harmonic distortion, which gives us a nice, almost like a sine to square wave shaper by adjusting this gain. Which is really nice. Now I'm in parallel mode, which means that input 1 on the left side is normal to input 1 on the right side. I'm not using the output, and I've got this in fix mode. But if we use evocation, we can feed back some of that right channel to the input of the first channel, which gives us some really interesting, almost wavefoldery kind of tones. Let's first up bring up that input 1 gain slightly on the right side, and then if I turn up evocation here, if you look at the scope, we're getting these kind of bat ears. Be as extreme or subtle as you like. But I've actually got a second envelope set up on stages being triggered by the same sequence. Let's use some CV to control that evocation, which just gives us this little slightly metallic ping at the start. And again, if we just play with the relative gains of the two sides, of this envelope CV and the shape of the envelope coming in. So all that from what started off as a pure clean sine wave. No filters involved, no external wavefolders, just some gain staging and feedback. Okay, so here's a little drone patch which uses two oscillators going into the two inputs on the first side of Orobas, running it in series mode, so it's going to run through the other side as well, which I've just got in fix mode, and I'm running the output through the MFX Quadra reverb, just to give it a little bit of space, and I'm just going to be using a CV sequence from step 8, just a really simple 8-step sequence there, to control the screen CV on the first channel to basically open the VCA. Now with the offset all the way down, these high steps are only putting out 5 volts at the maximum, so it's only those steps where the sliders are max which is actually opening the VCA at the moment, as you can hear these two little steps. Sophia is the main voice. I'm just running the kind of raw, slightly saturated sine wave fundamental output at the moment into channel 1. The second voice is Odessa, which I'll also be using as a sine wave, but just tuned up an octave and a fifth. So let's bring up the screen CV offset slightly. And now we're giving it enough voltage to kind of remain open. And now the CV voltage coming in from step 8 is controlling the amplitude, but also controlling the amount of distortion, or the amount of squaring off of that wave. So we can shape the tone quite a bit with this offset. That sequence is giving it a nice bit of, not only a little bit of dynamic variation, but some timbral variation too. And I've got, from one of the gate outputs of the 5th step of step 8, I'm running that into the evocation input, CV input, which is the feedback from, it'll feed back the output into input 1. So if we just bring up that attenuator slightly, just gives us a nice little gnarly accent on one of those steps. Just adds another dimension to that patch as well. Let's bring up a little bit of the Odessa voice as well, which is on input 2. This is tuned up slightly higher. see it start to impose itself on the wave there. And just by adjusting these relative levels of the two inputs, it's some really radical tone shifts, considering these are just sine waves coming in. Especially as this Odessa voice gets more and more dominant. We can also add some extra partials on Odessa, make that a little bit harmonically richer. The Sophia voice on the first input is just a sine wave, but I can make that a bit more complex too. Let's bring in one of the ripple elements on Sophia. Let's take Odessa out of the equation for a second. So now we're imposing this little bits of extra square from Sophia too. Okay, for this next patch I'm going to try something a little bit different, and I'm going to use two oscillators. I've got the Danny Sound EN129 and the Danny Sound Kalios just off screen here, both putting out sine waves. I'm going to mix them in Orobas using it as a kind of saturating mixer, and then run the output through a low-pass gate. I've got the Make Noise Optimix up here, and I've got the Geranalog Contour 1 acting as an envelope, and again I'm going to use the key step as a little sequencer. So let's get sequence running. So with the screen control set to fix, it's going to bypass the CV input, so I'm not using the screen CV at all, just kind of mixing it at max gain through the tube. And you can hear that sine wave's already being saturated quite a bit and kind of squared off, particularly the negative portion of the wave you can see on the scope. And if I increase that gain, it'll square off the whole thing to this nice kind of, quite a nice clean sounding square, especially when it runs through the LPG like that. Now the second oscillator, the Kalios, I've got running tuned up an octave and a fifth. And the two of these together, depending on the proportions you're mixing these two gains, you've got quite a nice kind of range of tones just by blending these like this. But one other thing I've tried is I've taken the higher pitched voice, the oscillator, the Kalios, I'm running that through a rectifier, full wave rectifier, and inverting it. And if I bring that into the suppress CV, which I've turned on here, if I bring that in, you can see it's adding this kind of high frequency component to the lower part of the wave, which gives us this nice bit of extra harmonic content. Just take that out again, without and then with. So between that and these two gains, turn these two sines into quite a complex tone. Let's try adding some drums. this is another patch where I want to explore using more harmonically complex input material to Orobas as a VCA. I've set up a voice over here using the New Systems Instruments modules. I'm using two oscillators. I've got a harmonic shift oscillator as the kind of master. I've got the sine output of that coming into just a pure unadulterated sine wave coming into input 1 of Orobas, which will be my kind of bass note. And then I'm using the other output through compare to generate a square wave, which is going to be used to sync the triphase oscillator, the second oscillator from New Systems, and I'm running the output of that through inertia acting as a low-pass filter. So we've got this kind of complex triple saw wave oscillator here. I'm modulating the phases of 2 of the 3 saws with LFOs from the quad LFO here. And then, yeah, that's running through inertia, being filtered and coming into the second input. And then the gate from my key step here is opening an attack, sustain, release envelope being made by stages. And yeah, with just the sine wave, it sounds like this. So I've just got a kind of simple sine here, not really saturated much yet. Again, as before, I can crank the gain to square it off a bit. But if I bring in the triphase oscillator, which is a kind of multiple saw wave thing synced to the first. Open the filter a bit. Now I'm going to add a little bit of cavernous reverb. Let's crank both of these. As you can hear, with this kind of complex material, it sounds absolutely huge. And by playing with the relative levels of the sine and the triple saw, and by playing with the frequency of the triple saw, which is synced to the first, filter. Let's get some more resonance on the filter. This is just one side of the Orobas, no feedback loops, no evocation going on. Honestly don't think it needs it. Okay, for this last patch I'm going to use a kind of hybrid approach where I'm going to use the left side of Orobas to mix some drums and a bass line, and I'm going to use the right side as a kind of VCA for the chords, which are going to come out of plats, and I'm going to put together a kind of down-tempo hip-hoppy kind of groove. Let's start with the drums. Using the Beat Step Pro here to sequence everything. I've got a kick and a snare sample from in the disting. I'm mixing that in the tip-top drum mixer up here, along with a hi-hat from the Western AD110, and a clave from the tip-top RS828. Just 4 drum sounds. They're being mixed and running through the MFX pocket plate reverb with a reverse going on, so we get this nice kind of reverse reverb as part of the groove. And I'm just going into the first channel, input 1. I've got this set to fix, no suppression, and yeah, output's up quite high, but the input gain's quite low, so it's not giving it too much saturation yet. And I can kind of just crank this to overload it, but it sounds quite nice around about 10:30, 11 o'clock like that. I've set the plate bias on this to 1. I think that sounds nicest when I'm mixing these external things. With 0, it's pretty dirty. That might be the kind of sound you want. Number 2, it's also quite dirty, but I quite like the sound of 1, especially when I bring in the bass line. Now that is the Danny Sound EN129 running through the Danny Sound multimode ladder filter and MMVCA, controlled by the Danny Sound looping VC ADSR envelope. Just a really simple saw wave kind of synth voice. And they sound quite nice together. And yeah, with this, when you're mixing on this side, it's quite easy for one sound to dominate. So I find setting the gain staging quite carefully is quite key, but I think with the plate bias at 1 and these two both around 10, 11 o'clock, it sounds pretty good. Now, the chord part, which I'm using the right side of Orobas for, that's plats being controlled from sequencer 1 in the BeatStep Pro, running the output through the Plum Audio Adver filter, which is wide open at the moment, and I'm controlling an envelope, or triggering an envelope rather, in stages from the BeatStep. That's gonna, it's a slow decay envelope which will open the VCA, and it sounds like this. Now there's a couple of other things to note with this. I've got a 16th note maraca that's being played from the drum pattern, and that's coming into input 2 on the chords channel. Let me just mute the drums and bass a second. You'll hear as I play this, there's a kind of shaker. Take it out. Just to add a little bit of extra rhythmic interest, that'll fade away with the chord fading. The other thing here, you might notice I've got the suppress CV input with the attenuator down. I've got a second envelope which I'm triggering in a similar pattern to the kick drum, creating an envelope from stages with that trigger, and then using that to kind of reduce the gain slightly, to kind of sidechain the chord basically in line with the kick drum. It's quite subtle, but you can just about hear it kind of ducking occasionally. And it's kind of more obvious when the drums are in. So let's run that sequencer part with a little pattern. Let's bring the filter down and add some modulation to that. So I'm going to leave it there for now, I think. Hope this has given you a bit of flavour of what Orobas can do and how tube-based VCAs can transform sound in some pretty creative ways. As usual, please give the video a like and a comment if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.